Moses was standing in the middle of nowhere when his life was interrupted by fire. Not the kind of fire that burns fast, eats everything in its path, and leaves nothing behind but ash. This fire was different. It was alive, but it was not consuming. It was burning inside a bush in the wilderness of Midian, far from the world. Moses once knew, far from the palace where he had been raised, far from the people he belonged to before he even fully understood who he was. He had run from Egypt. He had built a quiet life in exile. He had become a shepherd, the kind of man history usually forgets. And then, in a place where no one would have expected heaven to speak, a voice came from the fire and called his name. That moment is one of the most famous scenes in the Bible, but the question Moses asks there is often passed over too quickly. We remember the burning bush. We remember God telling Moses to go back to Egypt. We remember Pharaoh, the plagues, the Red Sea, the Exodus. But before any of that happens, Moses asks something incredibly important. He does not simply say, "What should I do?" He does not simply ask, "How will I convince Pharaoh?" He asks, "When I go to the people of Israel and tell them that the God of their fathers has sent me, and they ask me what his name is, what should I say?" That question sounds simple to modern ears, but in the ancient world it was loaded with meaning. Moses was not asking for a label. He was not asking for a religious brand name. He was asking about identity, authority, power, and presence. In the world Moses came from, names mattered. A name was not just something printed on a driver's license or written at the top of a resume. A name carried weight. A name revealed essence. A name told you what kind of power you were dealing with, what territory that power ruled, what limits it had, and how it could be approached. And the answer Moses receives is unlike anything the ancient world had ever heard. God does not give him a name like Ra. He does not give him a name like Osiris. He does not give him a name like Baal-Marduk or Anubis. He does not place himself inside the familiar religious categories of the nations. Instead, the voice from the fire gives Moses a phrase, a mystery, a revelation wrapped inside a verb. In Hebrew, it sounds like Ehyeh, Asher, Ehyeh. It has been translated in different ways. I am who I am, I will be what I will be, or even I am the one who exists. But none of those translations fully exhaust the depth of what is being said. Take a moment and feel the weight of that. In a world full of gods with fixed names, fixed roles, fixed powers, and fixed territories, the God of Israel reveals himself with a statement that refuses to be boxed in. He does not say, "I am the God of the river." He does not say, "I am the God of war." He does not say, "I am the God of fertility, weather, kingship, harvest, or death." He says, in effect, "I am. I will be. I will be present as I will be present." What sounds at first like an answer that avoids the question is actually one of the deepest revelations ever spoken. For thousands of years, theologians, rabbis, philosophers, mystic scholars, and ordinary believers have wrestled with those words. Why did God answer that way? Why not give Moses a simple name? Why use a verb? Why choose a phrase that seems to move between present and future being and becoming existence and presence? The answer matters because this name changes the way we understand God. It changes the way we understand his relationship with human beings. And it changes the way we read the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation. To understand what is happening at the burning bush, we have to step into a world very different from our own. The ancient world was saturated with gods. Every nation had its gods. Every city had its gods. Every river, storm, harvest, battlefield, sickness, and season could be connected to some divine force. People did not think of religion as one private category among many. Religion was woven into government, agriculture, family life, law, medicine, war, and economics. The gods were not distant ideas. They were part of the structure of daily life. And those gods had names, specific names. Names that could be invoked in rituals, carved into temples, written into spells, spoken in prayers, and used in ceremonies. In many ancient cultures, to know the true name of a spiritual being was to gain access to its power. A name could function almost like a key. If you knew the right name, said the right words, and performed the right ritual, you might be able to call upon that power, bargain with it, appease it, or even manipulate it. Moses knew that world well. He had grown up in Egypt, one of the most religiously complex civilizations in human history. Egypt was not spiritually simple. It had temples, priesthoods, rituals, myths, sacred writings, and a highly developed understanding of divine names. The Egyptians believed names carried power. In their stories, even a god could be vulnerable if someone discovered his secret name. One famous Egyptian tradition tells of Isis gaining power over Ra by learning his hidden name. That is the kind of world Moses came from. So when he asks God, "What is your name?" he is not asking a casual question. He is standing at the intersection of two worlds, the world of Egyptian religious power and the unknown God who is now calling him from the fire. And Moses also understands something else. The Israelites have lived in Egypt for generations. They have breathed Egypt's air, worked under Egypt's system, suffered under Egypt's oppression, and been surrounded by Egypt's gods. When Moses returns and says, "The God of your fathers has sent me," they will naturally ask what is his name, not because they are being difficult, not because they are looking for trivia. They are asking, who is this God? What kind of God is he? What can he do? Is he stronger than Pharaoh? Is he stronger than Egypt? Is he only the God of our ancestors, or is he active now? Has he remembered us? Can he actually save us? That is the question behind the question. And God's answer does not merely identify him, it reveals him. Ehe asher ehe, I am who I am. I will be what I will be. I will be present as I will be present. The Hebrew verb behind this phrase is connected to being, existing, happening, and becoming. But biblical Hebrew does not always work the way modern English does. English can make being sound static, like something sitting still in a philosophical category. But the Hebrew sense carries movement. It carries action. It carries the idea of presence breaking into reality. This is not just existence as an abstract concept. This is existence that shows up, presence that acts, being that moves into history. That difference is enormous. If God were merely saying, "I am the highest form of existence," then the statement would sound like a philosophical definition. And there is truth in that kind of reading. Later, thinkers, especially those influenced by Greek philosophy, would see in this name a statement about God as pure being, the necessary one, the source of all existence. That is a powerful tradition. But the original biblical moment is not a classroom lecture in metaphysics. It is a conversation at a burning bush with a broken man who is afraid to go back to the place that wounded him. Moses is not standing there as a philosopher with a notebook. He is standing there as a fugitive. He has already failed in Egypt once. He had killed an Egyptian run for his life and spent 40 years in the wilderness caring for someone else's sheep. According to the biblical story, he is now 80 years old. His great ambitions, if he ever had them, are buried in the sand. He is not looking for a mission. He is not campaigning to become a liberator. He is not building a platform or preparing a public comeback. He is simply living on the far side of the desert. Then God tells him to return to Egypt. Return to the empire he fled. Return to the people who may not trust him. Return to Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler Moses has ever known. Return and demand freedom for an enslaved nation. Moses responds like any honest human being would respond. Who am I that I should go? That question is not cowardice. It is realism. Moses knows his limitations. He knows his past. He knows Egypt. He knows Pharaoh. He knows that one man with a shepherd's staff does not simply walk into the center of imperial power and tell the king to release his workforce. From a human point of view, the mission is impossible. And notice how God answers him. God does not give Moses a motivational speech. He does not say, "Moses, you are stronger than you think." He does not say, "Believe in yourself." He does not say, "You have leadership potential." He does not hand Moses a list of impressive personal qualities. He says, "I will be with you." That is the heart of the name. When Moses asks, "Who am I?" God answers, "I will be with you." When Moses asks, "What is your name?" God's answer expands that same promise. The name is not merely a description of God in the abstract. It is a guarantee of God in the concrete. It is not just who God is above history. It is who God will be within history. It is not only a name to pronounce. It is a promise to stand on. In American culture, we are trained to think of identity in terms of personal branding. We introduce ourselves by what we do, where we work, what we have achieved, what school we attended, what title we hold, what kind of influence we have. Even in church culture, we sometimes reduce identity to roles, platforms, denominations, ministries, and labels. But at the burning bush, God reveals an identity that cannot be reduced to a job title or a function. He does not say, I am the God who performs one task. He says, I will be who I will be. In other words, you will know me by my faithful presence. You will know me as I act. You will know me as I keep my promise. That means God's name is not something Moses can use to control him. This is crucial. In the ancient world, names could be used as tools of spiritual control. But the name God gives Moses resists that completely. It is not a magic formula. It is not a secret password. It is not a spiritual technique. Moses cannot take this name back to Egypt and use it like a weapon he owns. The name itself declares God's freedom. He will be present, but he will not be manipulated. He will act, but he will not be controlled. He will reveal himself, but he will not be reduced. That alone separates the God of the burning bush from the gods of Egypt. The gods of Egypt had domains. One ruled the sun, another ruled the Nile, another was connected to death, another to motherhood, another to kingship. Their names place them within a system. But the God who speaks to Moses is not one more divine specialist added to the ancient religious marketplace. He is not competing for a department. He is not trying to prove that he is the best local deity among many. He is revealing himself as the living God whose presence cannot be confined to a place, a function, an image, or a ritual. And that matters because Moses is about to confront an empire that believes everything can be named, ranked, controlled, organized, and used. Egypt is a system of power. Pharaoh stands at the top of that system. The enslaved Hebrews are at the bottom. The gods support the system. The economy depends on the system. The army protects the system. The architecture celebrates the system. The pyramids, the temples, the monuments, the rituals, the royal titles, all of it says the same thing. Egypt is permanent. Pharaoh is untouchable. The slaves will remain slaves. But from a bush in the wilderness, God speaks a name that no empire can absorb. I will be what I will be. That is not just a theological statement. It is a direct threat to every system that claims final authority over human life. Because if God is truly the one who will be present as he chooses to be present, then Pharaoh is not ultimate. Egypt is not ultimate. Slavery is not ultimate. The past is not ultimate. Failure is not ultimate. Exile is not ultimate. Even Moses' fear is not ultimate. The story begins to turn right there before the plagues, before the sea opens, before the people walk out of bondage. It turns when God reveals that his name is active presence. The Exodus begins not with Moses' confidence, but with God's promise. Not with a strategy session, but with a revelation. Not with Moses discovering who he is, but with Moses encountering the one who says, I will be with you. And maybe that is why this passage still speaks so powerfully. Because everyone at some point stands in a wilderness. Maybe not a literal desert. Maybe it is a season of failure, regret, grief, confusion, exhaustion, or calling. Maybe it is the place where your old identity no longer works, but your new one has not yet been formed. Maybe it is the place where you feel too old, too late, too damaged, too ordinary, or too afraid. Moses meets God there. Not in the palace. Not in the center of power. Not when his life looks impressive. He meets God when he is hidden, humbled, and unsure. And the God who meets him does not begin by explaining everything. He begins by promising presence. That is the mystery of the name. God does not give Moses a definition small enough to master. He gives him a promise strong enough to carry him. He does not say, here is a concept you can control. He says, here is a presence you can trust. And from that moment on, the story of Moses is no longer really about Moses. It is about the God who will be with him in Pharaoh's court, at the edge of the sea, in the wilderness, on the mountain, and through every impossible step of the journey. The burning bush was not consumed, and neither was the name that came out of it. It has burned through centuries of interpretation, translation, debate, worship, doubt, and discovery. It still burns because it still refuses to be reduced. It still calls people to stop, turn aside, and ask what Moses asked. Who is this God? What is his name? And can his presence enter the wilderness of my life too? The answer, from the fire, remains the same. I am who I am. I will be what I will be. I will be with you. And that is where the mystery becomes even deeper. Because the words God speaks to Moses from the burning bush are not an isolated phrase, not a strange answer that appears once and then fades into the background of the story. They are connected to the most sacred name in the Hebrew Bible, the name written with 4 Hebrew letters, Yod He Vav He. Scholars often call it the Tetragrammaton, which simply means the 4-letter name. In most English Bibles, you do not see those 4 letters written out directly. Instead, you usually see the word Lord printed in small capital letters. That is not just a stylistic choice, it is a signal. It tells the reader that behind the English word Lord stands the personal covenant name of the God of Israel. And that detail matters more than most people realize, because the phrase I am who I am and the 4-letter name are not two unrelated ideas. They are connected at the root. They come from the same deep Hebrew world of being, becoming, happening, and being present. When God says to Moses, I am, he speaks in the first person. But when Israel speaks of him by the 4-letter name, they speak in the third person. It is as though God says, I will be, and his people respond, He is, he will be. He is the one who is present. He is the one who causes things to be. He is the one whose presence enters history. The voice from the fire and the name carried by the people are 2 sides of the same revelation. One is God speaking about himself. The other is God's people learning how to speak about him. This is easy to miss in English because I am who I am and the Lord sound completely different to our ears. One sounds mysterious and philosophical. The other sounds like a title of authority. But in the Hebrew imagination, they belong together. The God who says, I will be with you, becomes the God whose name Israel will remember in worship, prayer, prophecy, judgment, repentance, and hope. The God who speaks in first person from the burning bush becomes the God whose name is carried through generations. And that means the burning bush is not merely a private spiritual experience for Moses. It is the beginning of a national memory. It is the moment when the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob steps forward again, not as a distant figure from ancestral stories, but as the living God who is acting now. Moses is not being given a word for his own encouragement alone. He is being given the name by which an enslaved people will come to understand their past, their pain, their deliverance, and their future. Every time Israel later tells the story of the Exodus, this name will stand behind it. Every time the prophets cry out against injustice and idolatry, this name will burn beneath their words. Every time the Psalms praise the Maker of heaven and earth, the deliverer of the poor, the shepherd of his people, the rock of salvation, the 4-letter name, will echo in the background. This is not the name of a tribal deity trying to compete for territory. It is the name of the one whose presence cannot be captured by geography, monarchy, temple walls, or human control. He is the God who was with the fathers, who is now with Moses, and who will be with Israel in the story that is about to unfold. That connection would have mattered enormously to the Israelites. These were not comfortable people sitting around discussing theology as an intellectual hobby. They were slaves. Their lives were shaped by forced labor, fear, exhaustion, and generational trauma. Their children were born into bondage. Their bodies belonged to Pharaoh's economy. Their time belonged to taskmasters. Their future seemed already decided before they ever had a chance to dream. They had inherited stories about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, but those stories must have felt painfully distant. Abraham had been promised blessing. Isaac had inherited that promise. Jacob had wrestled with God and received the name Israel. Joseph had once risen to power in Egypt and saved his family from famine. But now the descendants of those promises were making bricks under oppression. Now they were crying out beneath the weight of an empire. Now it must have looked as though the God of the fathers had gone silent. So when Moses comes to them and says, "The God of your fathers has sent me," their question is not merely, "Which God are you talking about?" Their deeper question is, has he remembered us? Is the God of the old story still the God of our present suffering? Is the God who spoke to Abraham still able to speak in Egypt? Is the God who made promises to the fathers still faithful to their children? And the answer hidden in the name is yes. Not a sentimental yes, not a symbolic yes, a living, active, history-shaking yes. The name says, I am not only the God who was, I am the God who is, and I am the God who will be. That is why the 4-letter name is not only about divine existence in the abstract. It is about covenant faithfulness in motion. It is not merely that God exists somewhere beyond the universe. It is that God is present with his people inside the furnace of history. He sees, he hears, he knows. He comes down. That phrase, "I have come down," is one of the most powerful parts of the Exodus story. The God who cannot be contained by any image, any temple, any ritual system, or any human definition, speaks in the language of movement. He comes down. He enters the situation. He does not remain above suffering like a distant observer watching history from a safe height. He steps into the crisis. He does not send Moses because he is absent. He sends Moses because his presence is becoming visible in action. This is the difference between a philosophical God and the God of the Bible. A philosophical God may explain why the universe exists. The God of the burning bush enters the slave camp. A philosophical God may satisfy the mind. The God of Exodus hears the cry of the oppressed. A philosophical God may be admired from a distance. The God of Moses interrupts human history and says, "I have come down to deliver." That makes the divine name warm with movement. It breathes. It acts. It carries the promise that God's being is never passive. His existence is not like a stone sitting silently in eternity. His being is living presence. His name means that when his people are trapped, he is not trapped. When their future seems closed, he is not closed. When Pharaoh claims ownership over their lives, God's name announces a higher reality. Pharaoh says, "They belong to me." The name says they belong to the one who is. Pharaoh says, "Their labor is mine." The name says, "Their destiny is not yours to define." Pharaoh says, "This system will last forever." The name says, "I will be what I will be, and no empire gets the final word." Once you understand that the plagues of Egypt begin to look different, they are not random displays of supernatural force. They are not divine fireworks meant merely to impress the audience. They are a confrontation between the living God and the false certainties of an empire. Egypt had built an entire world of control. The Nile seemed to guarantee life. The sun seemed to guarantee order. Pharaoh seemed to guarantee political power. The gods seemed to guarantee the structure of the nation. The economy depended on slavery. The monuments celebrated domination. The religious system sanctified the throne. Everything in Egypt said, "This is permanent." This is how reality works. Pharaoh rules. The gods support him. The slaves obey. Nothing changes. But the name revealed at the burning bush begins to dismantle that lie before Moses ever reaches Pharaoh's court. Because if God is truly I am, then Pharaoh is not. If God is truly the one who will be present as he chooses to be present, then Egypt does not control history. If God is the one whose name is tied to being itself, then no human ruler can claim ultimate authority over life. That is why the name is dangerous. Not dangerous because God is fragile, and his name must be protected from sound. Dangerous because his name threatens every idol, every empire, every system that pretends to be absolute. The God of the burning bush does not enter Egypt as one local god competing with other local gods. He enters as the living God, before whom all false powers are exposed. The Nile can be struck. The sun can be darkened. The livestock can fail. The crops can collapse. The palace can tremble. The firstborn of Egypt can fall. Every layer of Egyptian security can be peeled back. Because none of those things is ultimate. The Exodus is not only a political liberation, it is a revelation of reality. It shows that the world is not finally ruled by Pharaoh, by violence, by economic exploitation, by military force, or by religious manipulation. The world belongs to the one who says, "I am." And this is why the name given to Moses cannot be treated like a magical formula. In the ancient world, divine names were often connected to ritual power. If you knew the right name and said the right words in the right way, you might gain access to a spiritual force. But the name God reveals refuses that entire system. Moses cannot use this name to control God. Israel cannot own this name as a weapon. Priests cannot turn this name into a technique. The name declares God's freedom as much as his faithfulness. "I will be what I will be" means God will be present but not manipulated. He will act but not as a servant of human agendas. He will reveal himself but not be reduced to human categories. He gives his name not so that people may control him, but so that they may trust him. That distinction is everything. A controllable God is an idol, even if the language sounds religious. A God who always serves our politics, our fears, our ambitions, our institutions, and our preferred outcomes is not the God of the burning bush. The God of the burning bush is faithful, but he is free. He is near, but he is not manageable. He is personal, but he is not small. He speaks his name, but the name itself prevents us from turning him into a possession. This brings us to one of the most fascinating and ironic chapters in the history of the divine name. Over time, the desire behind this practice was understandable. The commandment warned against taking the name of the Lord in vain, and devout readers did not want to misuse what was most holy. So when they came across the 4 sacred letters in the text, they would say Adonai, meaning Lord, instead of trying to pronounce the name itself. Later, when Hebrew scribes added vowel markings to the consonantal text, they placed the vowels of Adonai around the consonants of the 4-letter name as a reading cue. It was a signal to the reader: do not pronounce the written name. Say Lord. Much later, when some readers misunderstood that combination, it contributed to the form Jehovah, a hybrid form that became familiar in many Christian traditions. This history is not something to treat with arrogance or mockery. It was born from reverence. It came from a serious desire to honor the holiness of God. And yet there is a profound irony here. The name that God gave as his memorial from generation to generation became hidden beneath a substitute title. The personal covenant name became covered by the more general word Lord. What began as reverence eventually created distance. A name meant to reveal became a name many people no longer heard. A divine self-disclosure became wrapped in layers of caution, tradition, translation, and habit. And still the written text preserved it. That is remarkable. Human tradition may have covered the sound, but Scripture kept the letters. Public reading may have substituted the title, but the Bible carried the memory. Beneath all the layers, the fire was still burning. The name was still there. The connection between IAM and the 4-letter name remained written in the bones of the text. There is a lesson in that. Sometimes religious tradition begins as an effort to protect something sacred, but over time it can unintentionally obscure the very thing it meant to honor. A practice begins with devotion. Then it becomes a habit. The habit becomes a rule. The rule becomes a wall. Eventually, people may stand outside the wall, no longer able to see the beauty that first inspired the practice. This does not mean tradition is worthless. Tradition can preserve wisdom. It can protect memory. It can train reverence. But tradition must always be brought back to revelation. It must always be tested by the fire of the original encounter. The name of God was not given to disappear into silence. It was given so that his people would know who had delivered them, who had called them, who had bound himself to them in covenant faithfulness. True reverence does not hide God behind so many layers that his self-revelation becomes inaccessible. True reverence listens when God chooses to speak. That is why the 4-letter name becomes the center of relationship, not merely a subject for linguistic study. In the Bible, names are relational. To know someone's name is to be invited into some kind of encounter. When God gives his name to Moses, he is not giving Moses control. He is giving him a way to trust, remember, call, obey, and bear witness. The name becomes the anchor of covenant. It tells Israel, the one who delivered you is not nameless. He is not unknown. He is not one divine force among many. He has spoken. He has acted. He has attached his name to your story. This is why the Old Testament repeatedly says that God acts for his name's sake. To modern ears, that phrase can sound strange, as though God were worried about reputation in some insecure human way. But that is not what it means. God's name represents his revealed character, his covenant faithfulness, his public identity and history. When God acts for his name's sake, he is acting in faithfulness to who he has revealed himself to be. He is not protecting an ego. He is preserving the truth of his promise. And Israel desperately needs that, because Israel is not always faithful. Moses is not always confident. The people are not always grateful. The wilderness generation complains, panics, rebels, and romanticizes Egypt. They see miracles and still tremble. They receive bread from heaven and still grumble. They stand at the edge of promise and still want to turn back. If the covenant depended on the steadiness of human faith, the story would collapse almost immediately. But the name stands deeper than their instability. I will be what I will be does not mean God is unpredictable in a careless or chaotic way. It means He is sovereign, free, and faithful beyond the limits of human failure. That is why the name is both comforting and unsettling. It comforts because it promises presence. It unsettles because it refuses control. We often want a God we can define completely, predict completely, schedule completely, and manage completely. We want a God who fits our expectations, blesses our plans, confirms our assumptions, supports our group, and stays within the boundaries of our religious vocabulary. But the God of the burning bush does not submit to that. He tells Moses enough to trust him, but not enough to control him. And maybe that is what faith has always required. Faith is not control dressed in spiritual language. Faith is trust in the presence of one who is faithful, even when he is not fully explainable. Moses does not leave the burning bush with a complete map of the future. He does not know every plague in advance. He does not know every confrontation with Pharaoh. He does not know exactly how the sea will open. He does not know how long the wilderness will last. He does not know how many times the people will turn against him. He knows the name. He knows the promise. He knows I will be with you, and that has to be enough for the first step. In many ways, that is still how calling works. People often want certainty before obedience. We want the whole road illuminated before we move. We want guarantees that the outcome will make sense, that the risk will pay off, that people will understand us, that opposition will be brief, that the wilderness will not last too long. But Moses receives something different. He receives God's presence without receiving total control over the process. The name does not remove the difficulty of the mission. It transforms the meaning of the mission. Moses will still have to go. He will still have to speak. He will still face rejection, delay, conflict, fear, and exhaustion. Pharaoh will still resist. The people will still doubt. The wilderness will still be hard. But none of that will mean God is absent. That is the power of the name. It does not promise Moses an easy road. It promises that the road will not be empty. And that is the difference between a title and a name. A title can describe a role from a distance. A name invites relationship. Lord tells us something true about authority. Creator tells us something true about origin. King tells us something true about rule. Judge tells us something true about justice. But the sacred name rooted in I Am tells us something intimate about covenant presence. It is the name of the God who does not merely reign above the story but enters it. The God who does not merely observe suffering, but hears it. The God who does not merely remember promises emotionally, but acts to fulfill them. So when Moses leaves the burning bush, he carries more than a message. He carries a revelation that will reshape Israel's understanding of reality. The world says Egypt is permanent. The name says God is. The world says Pharaoh owns the future. The name says God will be. The world says Moses is too weak. The name says God will be with him. The world says slaves do not become free. The name says the living God has come down. And once that name enters the story, nothing can remain as it was. Egypt may still look powerful. Pharaoh may still sit on the throne. The Hebrews may still wake the next morning to forced labor. Moses may still feel fear in his bones. But the deepest truth has already changed. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has spoken again. The promise has moved from memory into action. The fire has appeared in the wilderness. And the name that cannot be controlled has begun to undo the empire that thought it controlled everything. And that is why the name revealed to Moses does not remain locked inside the Exodus story. Once that name enters Israel's memory, it begins to shape the entire biblical imagination. It becomes the dividing line between the living God and every false god human hands can make name decorate fear and worship. The prophets of Israel understood this with devastating clarity. When they confronted idolatry, they were not merely defending one religious label against another. They were not saying, "Our brand of divinity is better than yours." They were attacking an entire way of misunderstanding reality. Because an idol is not just a statue. An idol is any created thing treated as ultimate. It is anything human beings build, trust, fear, serve, or obey as though it had the power of life. And against all of that, the name from the burning bush stands like fire in the dark. I am. Not I was carved, not I was invented, not I was carried into the temple by the hands of men, but I am. The God of Israel is not made, he is not assembled, he is not dependent on the imagination of worshippers. He is the one who speaks before anyone can speak about him. He is the one who calls before anyone can call on him. He is the one whose being does not begin with human need, human fear, or human desire. He simply is, and because he is, everything else must be seen in relation to him. That is why the prophets often mocked idols in language that almost sounds harsh to modern readers. They describe idols as having mouths but not speaking, eyes but not seeing, ears but not hearing, hands but not feeling, feet but not walking. The point is not merely that statues are physically lifeless. The point is that idols are static. They cannot respond to history. They cannot enter suffering. They cannot hear the cries of slaves. They cannot call Moses from a bush. They cannot bring plagues upon Egypt, part the sea, feed a people in the wilderness, forgive sin, raise the dead, or make a covenant. They can be carried, but they cannot carry. They can be named, but they cannot reveal themselves. They can be polished, protected, and displayed, but they cannot act. The living God is exactly the opposite. His name is not a decorative label attached by worshippers. His name is his own self-revelation. He speaks. He hears. He sees. He comes down. He acts. He promises. He judges. He delivers. He remains free. And so the biblical conflict between God and idols is not simply a religious argument. It is a clash between living presence and dead objects, between the one who is and the things that merely appear to be. This is why idolatry is so dangerous. It does not only lead people to worship the wrong object, it trains the soul to expect too little from God and too much from created things. A person who bows before an idol is not only making a theological mistake, he is shrinking reality. He is replacing the living God with something manageable, something visible, something controllable, something that can be placed in a shrine and visited at convenient times. And human beings have never stopped doing this. Modern people may not bow before carved statues as often as ancient people did, but the instinct has not disappeared. We still build idols. We simply use different materials. We build them out of success, money, politics, national identity, religious systems, public approval, technology, romance, comfort, security, and even our own carefully curated sense of self. Anything can become an idol when we ask it to give us what only the living God can give. Anything can become Egypt when it claims ownership over our future. Anything can become Pharaoh when it tells us, "You belong to me." And this is where the name IAM becomes deeply personal. Because God's name does not merely expose ancient idols, it exposes ours. The name refuses to let us confuse God with the things we use to feel safe. It refuses to let us turn religion itself into a form of control. It refuses to let us reduce the living God to a system, a slogan, a political weapon, a cultural badge, or a private emotional experience. The God who says, "I will be what I will not be trapped in the machinery of human agendas. He cannot be made into a mascot for our fears. He cannot be reduced to the chaplain of our ambitions. He cannot be contained inside the borders of our institutions. He is present but free, near but sovereign, faithful but never domesticated. And that is both terrifying and beautiful. Terrifying because it means we cannot own him. Beautiful because it means no one else can own him either. That was exactly the truth Israel needed to learn over and over again. After Egypt, the temptation did not disappear. The same people who saw the Red Sea open later trembled at the foot of Sinai and built a golden calf. That detail is almost unbearable. They had been delivered by the God who refused to be imaged, named, or controlled like the gods of Egypt. And yet, when Moses was delayed on the mountain, they reached for something visible, something familiar, something they could see, something they could gather around, something that made the invisible God feel manageable. That is the seduction of idolatry. It offers certainty without faith, visibility without trust, religion without surrender. It gives people a God they can point to and say, "There he is," even if what they are pointing at is only the work of their own hands. The golden calf was not simply a failure of theology. It was a failure of patience. The people could not wait in the mystery of the God who had spoken from the fire. They wanted a God who could be controlled by proximity, a God whose presence could be guaranteed by an object. But the God of Moses had already revealed himself differently. His presence was not controlled by an image. His faithfulness did not depend on a statue. His name was the guarantee. "I will be with you." That is harder than a golden calf because it requires trust. But it is infinitely greater because only the living God can walk with his people through history. A calf of gold can glitter in the sunlight, but it cannot guide anyone through the wilderness. It can receive offerings, but it cannot give bread from heaven. It can stand in the camp, but it cannot lead by cloud and fire. This contrast continues through the prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Amos, and the others all speak into moments when Israel is tempted to forget the living God and trust what cannot save. Sometimes the idol is literal. Sometimes it is military alliance. Sometimes it is wealth. Sometimes it is ritual without righteousness. Sometimes it is temple confidence without obedience. Again and again, the prophetic message is the same. You cannot substitute religious appearance for living relationship. You cannot claim the name of the Lord while living as though his character does not matter. You cannot worship the God who hears the oppressed while becoming oppressors yourselves. You cannot invoke the name of the one who came down to deliver slaves and then build systems that crush the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. The name of God carries moral weight. To know his name is not merely to pronounce sacred syllables. It is to be summoned into his reality. That is why the name I Am is never just mystical. It is ethical. The God who is present in history demands that his people become present to the suffering of others. The God who hears cries expects his people not to ignore them. The God who breaks chains commands his people not to forge new ones. The God who refuses idols calls his people to refuse every false absolute. The name is not a charm. It is a calling. Israel bears the name of the living God, and therefore Israel must become a people whose life tells the truth about him. When they fail, the prophets confront them not because God's reputation is fragile, but because his name is holy. His name reveals who he is, and his people are not allowed to use that name while contradicting his character. This is why the Bible's critique of idolatry still feels so modern. We live in a world overflowing with images, brands, symbols, personalities, and systems that demand our trust. We are constantly being told what will save us. A product will save us. A leader will save us. A movement will save us. A relationship will save us. A career will save us. A bank account will save us. A body image will save us. A personal dream will save us. Even our phones train us to look down into a glowing object for reassurance, identity, distraction, and belonging. That does not mean technology is evil. It means the human heart is always capable of turning tools into temples. We still gather around golden calves. They are just smaller now, brighter now, more portable now, and sometimes more addictive than anything ancient people ever knew. But the living God still speaks a name that breaks the spell. I am. Not your success, not your fear, not your shame, not your past, not your political tribe, not your public image, not your trauma, not your bank account, not your failure, not your dream. I am. That name reorders reality. It tells every idol to step down from the throne. It tells every false master that it does not own the human soul. It tells every pharaoh, ancient or modern, that his empire is temporary. It tells every enslaved heart that bondage is not the final truth. The God who is cannot be defeated by things that only pretend to be. And when the biblical story reaches the New Testament, the echo of this name becomes even more intense. The Gospel of John in particular is filled with moments where the language of I am begins to shine through the life and words of Jesus. This is not accidental. John writes with the Exodus in the background. He knows the weight of the name. He knows that when Jesus says, I am, those words do not fall into empty air. They land inside a long history of fire, covenant, deliverance, wilderness, temple, prophecy, and hope. The same God who spoke to Moses from the bush is now being revealed in a way no one expected, not only through fire, not only through thunder, not only through plague and sea and mountain, but through a man walking the dusty roads of Galilee. There is a moment in John's Gospel when Jesus is speaking with the religious leaders in Jerusalem. The conversation grows tense. They appeal to Abraham. They speak of ancestry, authority, and identity. And then Jesus says something that sounds impossible, even outrageous. Before Abraham was, I am. Not I was. Not simply I existed before Abraham. The grammar itself creates the shock. Before Abraham came into being, I am. And the reaction is immediate. They pick up stones to throw at him. Why? Not because Jesus has made a confusing statement about age. Not because he has spoken in poetic exaggeration. They understand exactly what he is doing. He is reaching back to the language of divine self-revelation. He is placing himself inside the mystery of the name. He is saying in words no faithful Jewish listener could miss that the presence who spoke from the bush is somehow present in him. This is one of the most astonishing claims in the New Testament. Jesus does not merely come as a teacher pointing toward God. He does not merely come as a prophet speaking for God. He does not merely come as a moral reformer, a healer, a miracle worker, or a revolutionary figure. In John's Gospel, he speaks and acts as the visible embodiment of the divine presence. The IAM who called Moses is now standing face to face with people in Jerusalem. The one whose name could not be contained by Egypt, temple, or tradition is now contained in a paradox beyond comprehension in human flesh. And that is why the New Testament does not present Jesus as an interruption of Israel's story, but as its fulfillment. The fire in the bush has not gone out. It has drawn nearer. John gives us more than one echo. When Jesus walks on the water and the disciples are terrified, he says words often translated, "It is I, do not be afraid." But beneath that simple English phrase is the Greek expression ego eimi, I am. The scene is full of Exodus imagery. There is water, there is fear, there is divine presence coming to his people in a place where they cannot save themselves. And over the chaos, Jesus says, I am. Do not be afraid. It is as though the voice from the burning bush is now heard over the waves. The same presence that promised to be with Moses now comes to frightened disciples in the dark. Then come the great I am sayings of John. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way and the truth and the life. I am the true vine. These statements are not random metaphors. They are revelations of divine presence meeting human need. Hungry humanity meets the bread of life. A darkened world meets the light. Vulnerable sheep meet the shepherd. The dead meet resurrection. The lost meet the way. The rootless meet the vine. In each statement, the mystery of I am becomes concrete. The God who told Moses, I will be what I will be now, shows what that means in human terms. He will be bread for hunger, light for darkness, life for death, truth for confusion, shepherd for the lost, resurrection for the grave. This does not make the name smaller. It makes the mercy of the name visible. At the burning bush, God's answer was vast, open, and impossible to contain. In Jesus, according to John, that vastness enters flesh without ceasing to be vast. The eternal becomes touchable. The invisible becomes seen. The voice becomes human speech. The presence that filled the wilderness now sits at tables, touches lepers, weeps at tombs, forgives sinners, confronts hypocrites, feeds crowds, and washes feet. The God whose name no idol could capture is revealed not in a statue of power, but in a person of self-giving love. And that brings the contrast with idols to its deepest point. Idols demand sacrifice, but cannot love. The living God gives himself. Idols must be carried, but Christ carries the cross. Idols have mouths but do not speak. Christ speaks forgiveness from the place of execution. Idols have eyes but do not see. Christ sees the outcast, the sinner, the grieving, the forgotten. Idols have hands but cannot touch. Christ touches the unclean and makes them whole. Idols have feet but cannot walk. Christ walks into suffering, into death, into the grave itself. The living God is not merely alive in contrast to dead statues. He is life so abundant that even death cannot hold him. So the name that began in fire moves through the whole story like a hidden river. It burns in the bush. It confronts Pharaoh. It exposes idols. It speaks through prophets. It echoes over the waters of Galilee. It stands in the mouth of Jesus. It reaches its most shocking revelation at the cross and the empty tomb. The God who said, "I will be with you," has not abandoned that promise. He has carried it further than Moses could have imagined. He has become present not only to lead slaves out of Egypt, but to lead humanity out of sin and death. The name remains what it always was: mystery, presence, freedom, faithfulness. But now the fire has a face. And if the fire now has a face, then the story has moved into territory Moses could never have imagined. At the burning bush, the presence of God was hidden inside flame. It was near enough to call Moses by name, yet holy enough that Moses had to remove his sandals. It was personal but overwhelming. It was intimate but untouchable. But in the New Testament, that same mystery comes closer. The God who once spoke from fire now speaks through flesh. The presence that once burned in the wilderness now walks among fishermen, tax collectors, grieving sisters, sick bodies, hungry crowds, and frightened disciples. The name that could not be captured by idols now reveals itself in a living person. And that is why the Gospel of John feels so explosive. John is not simply giving us a biography of Jesus. He is showing us that the God who said, "I am" to Moses has entered human history in the most direct and astonishing way possible. This is why John begins his Gospel the way he does. He does not begin with Bethlehem. He does not begin with shepherds, angels, or a manger. He begins before the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That opening is not accidental. It reaches back to Genesis, back to creation, back to the first words of Scripture, back to the God who speaks reality into being. But it also reaches forward into Exodus, because the God who creates by His Word is the same God who reveals His name, calls Moses, and delivers His people. John is telling us that Jesus is not an afterthought. He is not a late addition to the story. He is not a religious teacher who appears long after Israel's God has already been defined. He is the Word through whom the entire story finds its deepest meaning. Then John says the sentence that changes everything: "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." The word translated "dwelt" carries the idea of pitching a tent, tabernacling, making His dwelling among His people. That language is soaked in Exodus imagery. In the wilderness, after God delivers Israel from Egypt, His presence dwells among them in the tabernacle. The glory of God fills the sacred space. The holy presence that cannot be contained, nevertheless, chooses to dwell in the midst of the people. And John says that in Jesus that same presence has come nearer still, not merely in a tent, not merely behind a veil, not merely in fire cloud or sacred architecture. The presence has taken on flesh. That means the mystery of I Am is no longer only heard in a voice from the fire. It is seen in a human life. In Jesus, according to the New Testament, the divine name becomes visible through mercy, truth, suffering, holiness, and love. This does not erase the mystery. It intensifies it, because the one who cannot be controlled chooses humility. The one who cannot be contained chooses a body. The one who told Moses, "I will be with you now," fulfills that promise in a way no one expected, by becoming Emmanuel, God with us. Not God above us only, not God beyond us only, not God against us in distant judgment only. God with us in hunger, with us in grief, with us in temptation, with us in tears, with us under injustice, with us even under death. And this is where the hidden thread becomes impossible to ignore. In Exodus, God says, "I have seen the affliction of my people. I have heard their cry. I know their suffering. I have come down to deliver them." In the Gospels, Jesus does exactly that on a deeper and wider level. He sees the crowds and has compassion. He hears the cries of the blind, the desperate, the unclean, and the grieving. He knows suffering from the inside. He comes down not merely from a mountain, not merely from heaven in a symbolic sense, but into the full condition of human life. The pattern is the same, but the scale has expanded. Egypt was one empire. Sin and death are universal powers. Pharaoh enslaved bodies. Sin enslaves the soul. The Red Sea blocked Israel's escape. The grave blocks humanity's hope. And the God who once made a way through the sea now makes a way through death. That is why the cross must be understood as more than a tragic execution. It is the deepest revelation of the name. At the bush, God said, "I will be what I will be." At the cross, we see how far that promise goes. He will be present even in rejection. He will be present even in blood. He will be present even when human power does its worst. He will be present where people think God is absent. He will be present in the place of shame, pain, abandonment, and death. The cross tells us that the IAM is not a distant force untouched by suffering. He is the God who enters suffering without being defeated by it. He is not consumed by the fire, and he is not conquered by the grave. That is why the resurrection is not simply a happy ending added after a dark chapter. It is the vindication of the name. The one who is cannot be held by death. The one who gives life cannot be permanently swallowed by the grave. The one who promised presence does not abandon his people at the final enemy. When Jesus rises, the New Testament is announcing that the God of Exodus has acted again, not merely to free one nation from slavery, but to open a new creation. The empty tomb is the Red Sea of the New Covenant. It is the place where the impossible way opens. It is the moment when the power that seemed final is revealed to be temporary. Just as Pharaoh's army could not follow Israel through the sea to reclaim them, death cannot hold the one who is life itself. And then when the biblical story reaches the book of Revelation, the echo of the burning bush returns in cosmic form. John hears the voice of the risen Christ, and the language expands beyond any single moment in time. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the one who is and who was and who is to come. These are not random titles. They are the name from Exodus stretched across all time. Present, past, and future are gathered into one declaration. The God who said to Moses, "I am," now reveals himself as the one who holds all history. He is the one who is. He is the one who was. He is the one who is coming. No empire stands outside his authority. No suffering falls outside his knowledge. No ending surprises him. No darkness outlasts him. That matters deeply because Revelation was written to people under pressure. It was not written as entertainment for people who wanted charts and speculation. It was written to believers facing empire persecution, compromise, fear, and spiritual exhaustion. They needed to know who truly ruled the world. Rome looked permanent. Its armies looked unstoppable. Its economy looked overwhelming. Its symbols filled public life. Its emperor demanded honor. Its violence shaped reality. And into that world, Revelation announces that Rome is not ultimate. The beast is not ultimate. Babylon is not ultimate. The throne belongs to God and to the Lamb. The one who is, who was, and who is to come has not surrendered history to empire. That is the same message Moses needed in Egypt. Pharaoh looked permanent. His system looked unbreakable. His gods looked ancient. His monuments looked eternal. But the name from the bush said otherwise. Now in Revelation, the same truth is announced again on a cosmic stage. Every pharaoh becomes temporary. Every Babylon falls. Every empire that builds itself on oppression, violence, seduction, and arrogance eventually meets the God who simply is. History does not belong to the loudest ruler, the richest city, the strongest army, or the most terrifying beast. History belongs to the one whose name outlives them all. This is why the Bible can be read as one long argument against false permanence. Human beings are constantly tempted to believe that the present arrangement of power will last forever. Slaves are told slavery is normal. The poor are told injustice is inevitable. The oppressed are told resistance is useless. The grieving are told death has the final word. The guilty are told shame is their true name. The wounded are told their past defines them. The fearful are told the future belongs to whatever they dread most. But the name of God interrupts every one of those lies. I am, I will be, I am the first and the last. Nothing else gets to claim eternity. That is the hidden thread running through Scripture. In Genesis, God speaks, and the world exists. Reality begins not with chaos winning, but with God creating. In Exodus, God speaks his name and the slaves are delivered. Freedom begins not with human strength, but with divine presence. In the prophets, God speaks against idols and injustice. Hope begins not with political optimism, but with the holiness of the living God. In the Gospels, God speaks through the Son. Salvation begins not with humanity climbing upward, but with the Word becoming flesh. In Revelation, God speaks from the throne. The end begins not with collapse into meaninglessness, but with the renewal of all things. From beginning to end, the Bible keeps returning to the same center God is. God speaks, God comes near, God acts, God remains faithful. And when you see that thread, the Bible stops looking like a disconnected collection of ancient religious documents. It becomes a unified witness. Yes, it was written across many centuries. Yes, it includes different genres: law, poetry, narrative, prophecy, wisdom, gospel letters, apocalypse. Yes, it came through different human authors, cultures, crises, and historical settings, but beneath all that diversity, there is a deep unity. The same fire burns through the whole story. The same name echoes across the ages. The God who creates, calls, delivers, judges, forgives, dwells, suffers, rises, reigns, and renews is not many gods wearing one label. He is the one who is. This does not mean every part of the Bible is easy to understand. It does not mean there are no difficult passages, no mysteries, no tensions, no moments that force us to slow down and wrestle. In fact, the name of God should make us more humble readers, not more arrogant ones. If God's own self-revelation cannot be reduced to a neat definition, then Scripture should not be treated like a set of shallow slogans either. The Bible is not a vending machine for quick answers. It is more like the burning bush itself. It keeps burning. You can approach it again and again, and it is not consumed. You can read the same passage for years and still find fire inside it. You can think you have cakes, only to discover that the story has begun to master you. That is especially true of the name. At first, I am who I am may sound simple. Then it begins to open. It speaks of existence, then presence, then freedom, then faithfulness, then covenant, then judgment against idols, then comfort for the oppressed, then mystery beyond language, then incarnation, then resurrection, then final renewal. The phrase is short, but it carries a universe. It is like a seed that contains a forest. It is like a flame that contains a sunrise. It is like a name that turns out to be the architecture of the whole biblical story. And this is why the name cannot be separated from worship. To worship the God of the Bible is not merely to acknowledge that a supreme being exists. It is to respond to the one who has revealed himself. Worship begins when we stop trying to make God in our image and allow his name to confront and remake us. It begins when we remove our sandals, not because the ground is magical, but because the presence is holy. It begins when we realize that God is not one more object in our world. He is the source of the world. He is not one more voice competing for our attention. He is the voice that gives meaning to every other voice. He is not one more helper for our plans. He is the Lord of history, the one in whose presence our plans must be surrendered, purified, and sometimes completely rewritten. That is what happened to Moses. The name did not simply comfort him. It redirected him. It sent him back to Egypt. It turned a shepherd into a messenger. It turned a fugitive into a witness. It turned a man who asked, "Who am I?" into a man who learned that the better question was, "Who is with me?" That is what the name does throughout Scripture. It changes the question. Abraham asks how promise can survive barrenness. God reveals himself as faithful. Israel asks how slaves can become free. God reveals himself as deliverer. The prophets ask how justice can survive corruption. God reveals himself as holy. The disciples ask how death can be defeated. God reveals himself in the risen Christ. The churches in Revelation ask how they can endure under empire. God reveals himself as the Alpha and the Omega. And the same shift still happens today. We often begin with ourselves. Who am I? Am I strong enough? Am I too late? Am I too broken? Am I too ordinary? Am I too guilty? Am I too afraid? Those are real questions, and God does not despise them. Moses asked his own version of them, but the name of God gently, powerfully moves us beyond self-measurement. The deepest truth is not found in the size of our ability, but in the faithfulness of his presence. The story does not depend on Moses being enough. It depends on God being God. The story does not depend on Israel being impressive. It depends on God remembering his covenant. The story does not depend on the disciples being fearless. It depends on Christ rising from the dead. The story does not depend on the church being stronger than empire. It depends on the Lamb being on the throne. That is not an excuse for passivity. Moses still had to go. Israel still had to walk. The prophets still had to speak. The disciples still had to follow. The churches still had to endure. Faith is not sitting still while God does everything around us. Faith is moving because God has spoken. It is obedience rooted not in self-confidence but in divine presence. It is courage born not from control but from trust. That is why the name is so powerful. It does not erase human weakness. It places human weakness inside a greater reality. Moses can tremble and still go. Israel can be afraid and still walk through the sea. The disciples can hide and still become witnesses. The church can suffer and still overcome. Because the decisive fact is not their strength. The decisive fact is the one who says, I am. By the time Revelation closes the biblical canon, the burning bush has become a new creation. The fire that once appeared in a desert now fills the final vision of history with glory. The God who came down to deliver Israel now comes down to dwell with humanity forever. The voice that spoke to Moses now declares that the dwelling place of God is with man. The promise I will be with you reaches its final form, God with his people, not temporarily, not partially, not through symbols only, but fully and forever. No more sea of chaos separating, no more empire enslaving, no more idols deceiving, no more death swallowing, no more curse. The name has reached its destination, and yet even at the end the mystery remains. God is still the one who is beyond every category, beyond every idol, beyond every human attempt to master him. The difference is that his mystery is no longer distant from his people. It is their light, their life, their home. The one who refused to be controlled has proven himself completely faithful. The one who could not be captured by a name small enough for human manipulation gave a name large enough to carry the entire story of redemption. The one who spoke from the fire has brought his people into a city where they no longer need sun or lamp because his presence is their light. That is the arc from Exodus to Revelation. A bush burns in the wilderness, and a voice says, I am. A man trembles, a nation is delivered, idols are exposed, prophets speak, the word becomes flesh, the cross reveals the depth of divine presence, the tomb opens the risen, Christ declares himself the first and the last, and history moves toward the day when God will dwell with his people forever. The name is not a footnote in the story. It is the flame at the center of it. It is the hidden thread tying the whole Bible together. And once you see it, you begin to understand that Scripture is not merely telling us what God has done. It is revealing who God is. And if Scripture is revealing who God is, then the question can no longer remain trapped in the past. It cannot stay in Midian, in Egypt, at Sinai, in Jerusalem, in Galilee, or on Patmos. At some point, the question moves toward us, because the burning bush is not only an ancient scene to admire from a distance. It is a mirror held up to every generation. Moses stood before the fire with fear, confusion, history, failure, and calling all tangled together inside him. And, in one way or another, every human being eventually stands in a place like that. Maybe not before a literal bush in the wilderness, but before a moment that interrupts ordinary life and forces the deeper questions to rise. Who is God? Is he really there? Does he know what is happening? Can he be trusted? And if he calls, will he also be present? That is why the name matters so much. I am who I am is not a cold theological puzzle meant only for scholars, rabbis, pastors, and philosophers. It is not a phrase locked inside ancient Hebrew grammar. It is a living revelation. It tells us that the God of the Bible is not a projection of human fear, not a product of religious imagination, not an idol shaped by culture, and not a distant force with no voice, no will, and no compassion. He is the one who speaks for himself. He is the one who reveals himself. He is the one who cannot be reduced to a slogan, a statue, a system, or a mood. He is not whatever we want him to be. He is who he is. And yet in his own freedom he chooses to be with his people. That is the wonder. The name does not make God less mysterious. It makes his mystery faithful. He is beyond us but not absent. He is holy but not indifferent. He is uncreated but not unreachable. He cannot be controlled but he can be trusted. He cannot be contained but he can come near. The God who says I will be what I will be is not refusing relationship. He is refusing reduction. He is telling Moses and telling us that no human mind can fully master him. No religious structure can fully contain him. No empire can command him. No crisis can exhaust him, and no darkness can erase him. That truth confronts one of the deepest instincts in the human heart. We want a God we can manage. We want a God who fits neatly inside our explanations. We want a God who confirms what we already believe, blesses what we already desire, and stays safely within the boundaries of what we find comfortable. Some people want God as a symbol of national strength. Some want him as a private source of comfort with no demands. Some want him as a weapon against their enemies. Some want him as a stamp of approval on their ambitions. Some want him as an idea to debate but never obey. And some want no God at all, because a living God would mean that we are not the center of reality. But the name from the fire resists all of that. I am means God is not built from our preferences. I will be means God is not trapped in our expectations. I will be with you means God is not distant from our weakness. This name breaks both arrogance and despair. It breaks arrogance because we cannot possess God. It breaks despair because no situation can exclude him. Moses cannot control him, but Pharaoh cannot stop him. Israel cannot manipulate him, but Egypt cannot defeat him. The disciples cannot fully understand him, but the grave cannot hold him. The church cannot domesticate him, but empire cannot silence him. That is why this name is still so powerful for people living today. We live in a world that constantly tries to name us before God does. The world names us by our productivity, our income, our appearance, our failures, our trauma, our politics, our relationship status, our public image, our usefulness, our past, or our performance. It tells us who we are by measuring what we have achieved, how we look, who approves of us, and what we can offer. And if we are not careful, we start believing those names. Successful, forgotten, damaged, too late, not enough, unwanted, guilty, ordinary, invisible, beyond repair. But at the burning bush, Moses learns that the most important name in the story is not his own. Moses asks, "Who am I?" and God redirects him toward, "I will be with you." That does not mean Moses is meaningless. It means Moses is not the foundation. His identity, calling, courage, and future do not rest on his own greatness. They rest on the presence of the one who sends him. This is a truth modern people desperately need. You are not saved by having a perfect self-definition. You are not held together by branding yourself well enough. You are not delivered by discovering some hidden greatness inside yourself. The biblical story does not begin with Moses finally believing in Moses. It begins with Moses encountering God. That changes everything. Because if the deepest truth is God's presence, then weakness is no longer the end of the story. Age is no longer the end of the story. Failure is no longer the end of the story. Exile is no longer the end of the story. Fear is no longer the end of the story. Moses is 80 years old, hidden in the wilderness, carrying a past he cannot undo. And still, God calls him. Not because Moses is impressive, but because God is faithful. Not because Moses has mastered his fear, but because God will be with him. Not because the mission is easy, but because the name is enough to take the next step. That is what the name offers us, not a life without wilderness, but a presence within it. The Bible never promises that the people of God will avoid difficulty. Moses still faces Pharaoh. Israel still walks through the desert. David still hides in caves. Elijah still collapses under exhaustion. Jeremiah still weeps. Daniel still enters exile. Mary still stands at the cross. The disciples still face storms, prison, rejection, and fear. Faith does not mean the road becomes simple. Faith means the road is no longer empty. The God who says I am is not only found at the destination, he is present in the journey, in the uncertainty, in the waiting, in the confrontation, in the silence, and even in the places where we are tempted to believe nothing holy could possibly be happening. This is also why the name invites honesty. Moses does not approach God with polished religious confidence. He questions, he hesitates, he asks how this can work, he asks what he should say. Later, he will even protest that he is not eloquent, and God does not erase the conversation. He allows Moses to bring his fear into the fire. That should matter to anyone who thinks faith means pretending not to struggle. Biblical faith is not the denial of questions. It is bringing the questions before the one who is. The burning bush does not shame Moses for asking. It reveals that the answer is deeper than Moses expected. So if you have questions, you are not outside the story. If you have doubts, you are not disqualified from encounter. If you feel unprepared, you are standing closer to Moses than you realize. The danger is not asking honest questions. The danger is settling for answers too small. The danger is trading the living God for a golden calf because mystery feels uncomfortable. The danger is choosing something visible, manageable, and false over the invisible presence of the one who truly is. The burning bush teaches us that God can handle our questions, but he will not shrink himself to fit our control. And this brings us to one of the most important implications of the name. If God is the living I Am, then every idol must eventually fall. Not only ancient idols, not only statues in temples, every false ultimate, every counterfeit savior, every created thing that demands the trust, fear, obedience, and devotion that belong to God alone. The name exposes them all. Money can be useful, but it cannot be God. Politics can be important, but it cannot be God. Family can be precious, but it cannot be God. Success can be meaningful, but it cannot be God. Comfort can be pleasant, but it cannot be God. Even religion can become an idol when it becomes a way to control God instead of surrendering to him. The name frees us from those false masters. It tells us that reality is not held together by our achievements, our institutions, our anxieties, or our illusions of control. Reality is held together by the one who is. This does not make life less serious. It makes it more truthful. It means we can work without worshiping work. We can love people without making them carry the weight of divinity. We can participate in society without turning political power into salvation. We can use technology without letting it define our souls. We can suffer without believing suffering is ultimate. We can die without believing death is final. That is where the name reaches its fullest hope in Christ. In Jesus, the I Am does not remain only a voice from the fire. He comes near enough to touch, near enough to suffer, near enough to bleed, near enough to enter the grave. The God who promised presence does not abandon humanity at the place where we are most helpless. He meets us there. At the cross, he is present in suffering. In the resurrection, he is present beyond death. In the Spirit, he is present with his people still. And in Revelation, he promises a day when that presence will no longer be hidden, partial, or contested. God will dwell with his people and they will be his. That final promise is the completion of the burning bush. In Exodus, God says, "I will be with you," and that promise carries Moses into Egypt. In the wilderness, God dwells among Israel through cloud, fire, tabernacle, and covenant. In the Gospels, the Word becomes flesh and dwells among us. In the church, the Spirit makes God's presence known among his people. And at the end of the story, the dwelling place of God is with humanity forever. The whole Bible is moving toward presence, not merely escape from earth, but the healing of creation. Not merely souls going somewhere else, but God making all things new. Not merely religion as ritual, but communion as destiny. This means the name is not only an answer to Moses. It is an answer to the ache beneath human history. We ache for someone who is truly there. We ache for a presence that does not abandon us. We ache for a truth deeper than change, a love stronger than death, a holiness purer than our corruption, a mercy greater than our failure, a future larger than the grave. The name speaks to that ache. I Am. Not as an idea floating above us, but as the living God who creates, calls, delivers, judges, forgives, comes near, dies, rises, reigns, and renews. And that is why the bush still burns. Empires have risen and fallen. Languages have changed. Traditions have formed, fractured, and reformed. Philosophers have debated. Skeptics have questioned. Believers have worshipped. Nations have vanished. Temples have been destroyed. Libraries have burned. Generations have come and gone. But the name remains in the text like a flame that cannot be consumed. It still calls people to turn aside from the noise of ordinary life and look again. It still asks us to remove our sandals, not literally perhaps, but inwardly, to approach with humility, attention, reverence, and readiness. Moses could have walked past the bush. That is a haunting thought. The text says he turned aside to see why the bush was not consumed. He paused long enough to notice the mystery, and perhaps that is where encounter often begins, not with having every answer, but with stopping long enough to pay attention. The world trains us to rush past burning bushes. We are busy, distracted, entertained, anxious, informed, and overwhelmed. We scroll past wonder. We explain away mystery. We drown out silence. But the name of God is not heard by a soul that never stops. Moses turned aside, and when he did, he heard his name. Maybe that is the invitation at the end of this story. Turn aside. Look again. Do not settle for the gods that can be manufactured, marketed, controlled, and consumed. Do not settle for a version of God small enough to fit your fear or convenient enough to serve your plans. Do not settle for an idol, even a religious one. Stand before the fire of revelation. Listen to the name that cannot be exhausted. The God of the Bible is not asking to be added as one more object in your life. He is revealing himself as the ground of life itself. The one before whom every other name, power, wound, fear, and hope must find its place. The story began with a shepherd in the wilderness, but it does not end there. It moves to Egypt, to Sinai, to the prophets, to Bethlehem, to Galilee, to the cross, to the empty tomb, to the throne room of revelation, and finally to a renewed creation filled with the presence of God. Through it all, the same name burns. I am who I am. I will be what I will be. I am the Alpha and the Omega. The one who is and who is to come. And for the person listening right now, standing in whatever wilderness life has brought, the promise has not lost its power. The God who spoke to Moses has not changed the grammar of his faithfulness. He is still the one who is. He is still the one who will be. He is still the one who comes near. He is still the one who cannot be consumed. The fire is still burning. The name is still speaking. And the question is whether we will turn aside and listen.